Alright then, I think it's time to start talking about triangle strategy. Well, sort of. I'm calling this an impressions video, but in reality this is more like an immediate reaction piece to the entire game, because at the time I'm writing this, I've just finished playing through every story branch. That said, I'm well aware that story is central to triangle strategy, and that as we're still only 2 weeks after release, many people either haven't finished the game or have only played it through once or twice. To that end, I'm dividing this video into 2 sections. The first will be free of any story spoilers, and will only discuss gameplay and what information we had from the 2 demos and various trailers, while the latter portion of this video will be full of spoilers. I will be avoiding using any gameplay footage or screenshots today, both to keep spoilers to a minimum and, to be perfectly honest, to reduce production time on this video since I really want to channel my energy in talking about triangle strategy on YouTube into a later project. With regard to spoilers, I'll change the image on the screen and give you guys a heads up when we're headed that way, so don't worry about getting caught off guard. The only major gameplay mechanic I'll be spoiling in the first part is that there's New Game Plus. But with a game like this, I don't think anyone will find that terribly shocking. If you were to ask me if I liked triangle strategy, the short answer is yes, although there are some qualifiers to that statement, only some of which I'll be talking about today. The rest I plan to turn into a thesis for a proper video essay I intend to release at some point in the next month or so. And I get the impression that I won't be the only person in that boat, since triangle strategy is one of those games that's hard to break down after only a few days. It needs to percolate for a bit, and based on some that I've seen, professional reviewers tend to agree with me. Yes, the beginning is slow-paced and there's a lot of dialogue scenes to sift through, and while the visual presentation and music are certainly charming, the voice acting is hit or miss, to put it politely. If you can make it past the early game though, the game's quality starts to shine. The plot picks up only a few chapters in and doesn't really let up from there, and the conviction system allows for meaningful story branching that can be hard to appreciate on a first run but gets significantly more impressive in New Game Plus. This is because in New Game Plus you can actually see which of the 3 convictions you're building with each of your actions, giving you a greater feeling of control. And also because once you play through multiple branches of the same chapter, you start to appreciate how much thought went into mapping out the plot so that, despite some significant variations, it follows roughly the same trajectory up to a key point. I and others have made the remark that triangle strategy is often more akin to a visual novel than a tactics game. But know that when I say that, I don't mean it as a criticism. Visual novels can be a deeply fun and engaging medium in their own right, and I actually think it's kind of impressive for a big publisher like Square Enix to put out a game that leans this hard on its story, especially in the wake of Octopath Traveler, which mostly phones in its story and character interactions to instead prioritize an exciting gameplay loop. For what it's worth, you can skip or speed through all of the cutscenes in Triangle Strategy and still come away with a competent tactical game, and there have been times on later runs when I've skipped cutscenes because I'd seen them before. But I have trouble imagining why you'd be into this game and not care about its story when that's at least half the experience. That's not to say that the tactical element of Triangle Strategy is lacking, though. I'm by no means a tactics expert, nor am I widely familiar with the genre, but there's something to be said for gameplay that continues to feel fresh even after multiple runs. Dynamic level scaling is a big part of that, increasing the challenge in New Game Plus and also allowing you to recruit new characters at basically any time without having to worry about needing to grind to catch them up to the rest of your roster. Map design plays a role too, with terrain, weather, and elevation all varying substantially from battle to battle. Some maps come with unique gimmicks as well, like the version of Chapter 7 in the first demo with elevators characters can ride up and down and fields of wheat that can be set on fire. Chapter objectives and generic enemies are less diverse, but the bosses and the sheer array of skills that your opponents can bring to bear against you more than make up for it. The same is true for the playable cast. Early concerns over linear character progression mostly bear out, but in my opinion, Triangle Strategy uses that to maximum advantage in having each character in the extensive roster play very differently. Of course, some fill similar roles in combat, and this has already generated some entertaining back and forth over which character is the best archer or the best healer or so forth, but I do think that the answer to those questions is ultimately going to come down to personal preference and playstyle when each character comes with around half a dozen unique skills in addition to the differences in their statistical parameters. For a particular example, I personally love the mages in this game, because even though there's around 6 or 7 characters who fit the description of squishy magic user, their skill sets and synergies are all suited for different maps and situations, and they cover a wide range of combat roles from pure damage to crowd control to mobility to healing. There's a lot to play with here despite the linear progression is what I'm saying, and in a game like this, I consider that to be more effective than an open class system. Each unit has their role to play, and in almost all cases that further informs their character in ways that would be weakened if you could just switch them to a different role on the fly. It'd be a little strange if you could, for instance, turn Anna the spy into a tank or a healer, wouldn't it? In any case, with such a large roster to play around with and a full set of weapon upgrades to build for each character, I had plenty to keep myself occupied while I worked my way through the multiple runs needed to experience the game in full. On the subject of characters, however, I do feel like I need to make a little gripe here. Triangle Strategy has a large cast of characters, but outside the protagonist and the 7 characters who participate in the voting segments, I can't say they're handled all that organically. Some of the other characters do show up in certain story segments, but half the roster is recruited purely based on your conviction values, which greatly limits the amount of interaction they can have with the plot or with other characters. That interaction mostly takes the form of what are called character stories, wherein a character will get 2 cutscenes after they're recruited, usually involving a member of the voting cast in a supporting role. These cutscenes invariably work on a basic setup and payoff style of storytelling, typically exploring the character's backstory and motivation for fighting. Nothing groundbreaking, but I did find some of the stories cute or funny or mildly affecting. What bugs me about them, though, is that Triangle Strategy has no event gallery, or even a log just for the character stories, which can both make it difficult to remember what's going on in the side stories of these optional recruits, as well as renders it impossible to see these scenes again short of starting a completely new file and going through the process of recruiting these characters and unlocking their stories all over again. Because character stories unlock based on how many times you've deployed a particular character in battle, it can take quite some time to see everything. Furthermore, outside of these little vignettes, half of the total roster spend all their time hanging out in your encampment and repeating the same bits of dialogue about their newest promotion, or weapon upgrade, or resolution to their story, so it all comes off feeling quite disconnected. As I predicted in my previous videos, and as I intend to go into further in a later one, Triangle Strategy is not a story that you follow because you're deeply invested in the characters, especially not the minor ones, but a more robust mechanism for character interaction outside the main plot would have really been appreciated here. With that, I think I've just about exhausted what I can say about this game without delving into heavy spoiler territory, so if you haven't completely finished Triangle Strategy and want to discover its story for yourself, this is your warning. If this is where you're getting off, I'd greatly appreciate it if you like the video and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and comment down below how you're feeling about Triangle Strategy if you're playing it now, or if you're thinking about playing it but still aren't sure. Everyone else, let's talk spoilers. To answer a quick question you might have if you've been keeping up with my content for a while, it is possible to do 100% completion for Triangle Strategy, although the means to do so are straightforward enough not to require extensive spreadsheets like I've made for certain other games. Oddly so, too, because before the game came out, data miners were making spreadsheets mapping out its story structure. But as there's an in-game feature that keeps track of that, there's not much need to manage it yourself in the final game. There's a specific sequence of events needed to access the Golden Route, and you're very unlikely to discover that route yourself without a guide, but as we'll talk about in a bit, I wouldn't be surprised if the developers didn't want you to look that solution up in your runs after the first. Additionally, recruiting and maxing out the levels, classes, and weapons of all 30 characters is trivial enough with only a small amount of grinding if you're doing it over the 4 runs necessary to see the whole story. So as someone who loves completing the full checklist of things to do in a video game, I have to say that from that angle, I find Triangle Strategy satisfying, if not all that mentally demanding. The story, on the other hand, does hold up very well, I think, to its promise of a branching narrative with multiple outcomes. That's not immediately apparent for most of a single playthrough, because throughout the mid-game, story branches exist in roughly self-contained little arcs of 1 or 2 chapters at most, and it's not until the game's final vote that the narrative decisively splits into different paths for good. As I said in the spoiler-free section, it's often pretty impressive to watch Triangle Strategy work to keep its story fundamentally linear up to that final vote, so I'm not knocking that decision. Were the story only allowed to keep branching, I imagine that the route splits would become so numerous and so varied that any attempt at writing even somewhat satisfying conclusions in all scenarios would quickly be lost. At its core, the story of Triangle Strategy is a rather simple one about a multi-sided war over limited resources, and so it can incorporate these smaller arcs along the way to the ending that branch out just enough to explore a few different possibilities in one corner of the broader canvas of Norzelia, like Sorcely End's illicit salt trade, or the Rosellan village in the Wolfort domain, for example, and converging again each time to keep the plot moving toward the decisive end of the war. Oh, and incidentally, can I just say how refreshing it is that the story of Triangle Strategy is so fundamentally mundane? People were making jokes about wars over salt back when the first demo came out, but though it sounds a little silly now, there were actual historical wars over salt, because prior to modern canning and refrigeration practices, salt was essential for food preservation among various other uses. It's quite the grounded source of conflict, and moreover, the game never pulls out a dragon or a dark cult as a greater scope villain, but instead sticks to telling a fairly realistic political war story. Now, about those endings. It should come as no surprise that the result of the final vote, or what might be called Triangle Strategy's route split, is the story element that a lot of people, myself included, have been most interested in. The first time I made it to Chapter 17 and saw that vote laid before me, I instantly thought back to an observation in a video I made on Triangle Strategy during pre-release, namely that S-Frost and Hyzant seem to represent 2 convictions at the expense of a third. As it happens, I believe that idea does appear in the game itself, although less with Norzelia's nations than with the 3 supporting characters whose argument leads into the final vote. Pre-release trailers align each of them with a certain conviction, and yet their plans for endgame are each aligned with a different conviction. I posit then that these 3 endings are not meant to be read as individual convictions taken to extremes, but rather one conviction neglected to prioritize the other 2. This manifests directly in the character aligned with the 3rd conviction permanently leaving your party. So, for example, the morality-aligned Roland will leave if you go with the liberty plan of the utility-aligned Benedict. Indeed, this reading bears out the more you look at each of these endings. Roland's and Benedict's are functionally opposite, as you ally with either Hyzant or S-Frost to bring down the other and so spread the deeply flawed ideology of your ally to all of Norzelia. I see a lot of people online saying that Roland's route is the worst, because it sees him give up his kingship to Hyzant so they can conquer and convert the continent. But personally, I feel like these endings balance each other fairly well. Roland takes the classically utilitarian position of allowing the few to suffer for the betterment of the many, whereas Benedict spreading S-Frost's ideals of freedom and individual merit to the continent leads to an era of unfettered capitalism where the rich get richer, where, in other words, the many suffer to profit the few. Both endings prioritize utility in the form of widespread betterment, but Roland upholds morality in the form of duty toward his people, while Benedict becomes liberty-aligned when he's eventually revealed to be the most selfishly motivated of the 3, maneuvering Serenoa onto the throne of Glenbrook to correct his own perceived failure to protect Serenoa's mother. Frederica's ending, meanwhile, combines morality and liberty into what is, tonally speaking, the most heroic route of the 3, as Serenoa frees the Roselle from slavery and even sacrifices his life so that Frederica can lead her people to a new life in their mythical homeland. But at the same time, it plunges Norzelia into constant warfare with no one to mediate over ownership of the salt. Liberty has truly the narrowest focus of the 3 convictions, and as well-meaning and righteous as it may be, Frederica's ending winds up just as intentionally unsatisfying as the others as a result. Well, excluding the golden ending, of course. The existence of golden routes in games with branching storylines is a contentious topic. Some people love them for allowing for a broadly satisfying ending that wraps things up in the best possible way, while others despise them for arguably stripping all meaning and relevance from the other endings which might easily be considered inferior, or even non-canonical. I can see the merits of both sides of this argument, and I tend to take the issue on a case-by-case basis. When it comes to Triangle Strategy, it's very clear that the developers want you to want a golden route, as the three initiated by the final vote all destroy Serenoa's relationship with one of the major supporting characters and lead to serious, far-reaching negative consequences for Norzelia. It's only natural that after watching one or more of those endings that players would want to search for a different path, one not decided by the scales of conviction. The path to unlocking the golden route is not exactly the most intuitive, and it requires you to take sides in certain votes that are framed as being less righteous or moral, which leads me to believe that you're pretty much expected to look up the solution online. I can't imagine how many runs you'd likely end up doing if you tried to get there purely by trial and error. In any case, once that scenario is unlocked, Serenoa ignores the scales and makes an executive decision intended to satisfy all parties. I had to laugh a bit to watch the game discard its central mechanic of democracy by simple majority, and how the best possible outcome in this world of autocrats basically has you get Serenoa to function as an autocrat. The joys of unintentional messaging, right? But yes, the golden route does indeed come away as the most satisfactory to the playable cast, and to all of Norzelia, even if it's honest enough to allow main villain Edor to make an important point about human weakness and greed and the impossibility of making everyone happy. There's no truly sour note here like in the other endings, but I still appreciate that Triangle Strategy understands that giving a political war drama an unambiguously happily ever after would look a little silly. The golden route leaves Hyzant in shambles both economically and socially. There are seeds for potential succession crises in both Esfrost and Glenbrook later down the line, and perhaps most frustrating for people looking for solid character investment, this epilogue doesn't include a single scene of Serenoa and Frederica speaking before or during their wedding. Much like Octopath Traveler before it, Triangle Strategy seems hesitant to commit to romance among its main cast, even when it comes to its lead character and his betrothed, and in general, the game prioritizes the complexities of its plot structure over deep, resonating character development. As you might expect if you'd seen some of my past stuff, I have more to say on that subject, but I'll save that for the actual video essay. That's going to do it for my ramblings today, though. I may still have my concerns about the longevity of Triangle Strategy in fandom, but if it's given me this much to talk about and then still left me with plenty else for later, I'd say that speaks well to its ability to generate conversation, at least in the short term. If you play Triangle Strategy, I'd like to see what you have to add to that conversation in the comments, so fire away. Just be mindful of spoilers as a courtesy to others, to whatever extent you can do something like that on YouTube. Likes and channel subscriptions are also appreciated, and they tell me that people are enjoying my Triangle Strategy content. It's really all thanks to my subscribers, and especially to my patrons, that I can continue making these videos. You guys are all great. Au revoir!